In the quiet town of Dry Creek, where the sun always seemed to shine a little too brightly and the wind carried whispers of old stories, there was a rancher named Henry McAllister. Henry was a man who had spent his life working the land, and his name was known far and wide as a man who could tame the wildest horse and bring order to the most chaotic of situations. He had inherited his father's ranch, a vast spread of land that stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with grazing cattle and sprawling fields of wheat. It was a place where hard work was the rule, and tradition was held above all else. But there was one tradition on the ranch that made Henry uneasy, though he never spoke of it aloud. It was a custom that had been passed down from his father to him and from his grandfather to his father before that. It was a tradition that involved the women of the family, and it had become something that Henry believed his daughter, Eliza, would one day face. Eliza was Henry's pride and joy. From a young age, she had shown a sharp mind and an independent spirit. She could ride a horse better than most men in town, and she had the same fiery determination that ran through the veins of every McAllister. Yet despite her strength, there was one thing that she could not escape: the same tradition that Henry had faced in his youth, and that his mother had forced upon him when he was a boy. It was a strange, almost cruel rite of passage. When a McAllister woman came of age, she was expected to untangle the thick, knotted reins of the family's oldest horse, a task that could take hours, sometimes days, depending on how stubborn the ropes had become. It was a test of patience, endurance, and strength, a test that proved a McAllister woman was ready to take her place in the family's legacy of hard work. Henry had never liked the tradition. He had always believed it was unnecessary, that Eliza had already proven herself time and time again. But the tradition was old, and it was something that could not be ignored. His mother had made him go through it just as her mother had made her go through it. It was simply what had been done for generations. And so one warm spring morning, Henry found himself walking towards the barn, a feeling of unease in his chest. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow across the fields, and the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass was the only noise that broke the silence. As he approached the barn, he saw Eliza standing by the corral, her hands gripping the reins of the old horse, looking out at the tangled mess of ropes. It was the moment he had been dreading. Eliza turned to her father as he approached. Her face was a mask of determination, but Henry could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had always known this day would come, and now it was finally here. The reins, thick and twisted, lay in front of her like an unspoken challenge. "Morning, Pa," Eliza said, her voice steady but with a hint of nervousness. "Morning, Eliza," Henry replied, his voice gruff but warm. He looked at the reins, knowing what they represented. He had spent years trying to prepare her for this moment, even though he didn't believe in the tradition. It was the way it had always been done, and in this world the old ways were often harder to break than the stubbornest knot. Eliza swallowed, her fingers flexing around the reins. "I'm ready, Pa," Henry nodded, though his heart was heavy. He had never liked this part of being a father, the moment when he had to watch his daughter struggle with something so pointless, yet so ingrained in the family's way of life. He remembered when he had been her age, standing where she stood now, his own father watching him. He had felt the same mix of frustration and defiance. The reins had seemed like a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world, but he had done it. He had untangled the reins just as his father had, and now it was Eliza's turn. "Take your time," he said quietly, watching as she stepped forward and knelt beside the tangled mess. "It's never easy." Eliza nodded, taking a deep breath as she bent to the task. Her hands moved carefully at first, attempting to pull the ropes apart with patience. The sun beat down on her, but she didn't mind the heat. She had worked in the fields during summer, spent hours riding horses in the blazing sun. Yet this felt different. The reins were a reminder of the expectations placed on her, not just by her father, but by generations of women before her. As she worked, Henry stood back, watching her with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He knew she could do it. She was stronger than any of the women in their family before her. But he also knew that the reins were not just a test of physical strength. They were a test of something deeper, something that Eliza had struggled with for years. "Why do we still do this?" Eliza asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Henry hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "It's what we've always done. It's tradition. It's the way your grandmother did it and her mother before her. But it doesn't make sense, Pa. Eliza replied, her voice tight with frustration. Why do I have to prove myself this way? Haven't I already proven enough? Henry looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He wanted to tell her that he agreed. He wanted to tell her that she didn't have to do this, that she had already proven herself time and time again. But he couldn't bring himself to break the tradition. Not yet. I know it seems silly, he said quietly, but it's how it's been done. It's part of who we are. Eliza shook her head, frustration bubbling up inside her. I don't want to be part of who we were, Pa. I want to be part of who I am. Henry didn't answer right away. His heart ached with the knowledge that his daughter, the girl he had raised, was standing at the crossroads of tradition and change. He wanted to support her, to tell her that she didn't have to do this, but he felt the weight of family legacy pressing down on him. Just do your best, he said softly, turning to walk back toward the house. He couldn't watch her struggle with this any longer. It hurt too much. Eliza didn't say anything as she continued her work, but in her heart she knew this was more than just a task. It was a battle she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The morning sun climbed higher into the sky, casting its warm, golden light across the McAllister ranch. Eliza sat on the dusty ground, her knees pressed to the earth, her hands tangled in the thick ropes of the old horse reins. Sweat glistened, on her forehead the heat of the day beginning to take its toll. But she refused to stop. She pulled harder, twisting and turning the ropes in her hands, trying to make sense of the knots that seemed impossible to untangle. Each tug only seemed to make the knots tighter. Each twist of the rope felt like a reminder of the challenge before her. Eliza had always prided herself on being capable, on never backing down from a difficult task. Whether it was mending fences, herding cattle, or breaking wild horses, she had always risen to the occasion. But this tangled mess of reins, was different. The tradition had been clear since she was a child. When a McAllister woman reached a certain age, she was to untangle the reins, the symbol of her place in the family. It was a ritual that marked the end of her childhood and the beginning of her adulthood. Eliza had always known this moment would come, but now that it was here, it felt like more of a burden than a rite of passage. Eliza glanced at the reins again, her frustration building. She had tried everything. She had worked at it for hours, but no matter how much she pulled or twisted, the ropes wouldn't budge. They were stubborn, like the old traditions that weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had tried to push those traditions aside, to live her own life in her own way, but it was never that simple. She could hear her father's voice in her mind, echoing in the silence of the barnyard. You have to do it, Eliza. It's the McAllister way. The words, though familiar, no longer felt like encouragement. They felt like chains, binding her to a past she wasn't sure she wanted to be part of. She stood up, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Her arms ached and the sun was making her dizzy, but there was no turning back. Her father had always told her to finish what she started, to never leave a job undone. The reins were no different. She had to prove she could do it, no matter the cost. But what cost would that be? Eliza wasn't sure anymore. The more she struggled with the reins, the more she realized how much this task symbolized everything she had been trying to escape. The expectations of her family, the weight of the past, the pressure to follow in the footsteps of women who had come before her. She wasn't like them. She didn't want to be like them. As she knelt down again, her fingers fumbling with the ropes, a wave of doubt washed over her. Was this all worth it? Why did she have to prove herself in this way? The thought of untangling the reins felt less like a challenge and more like a pointless exercise in tradition. She had already done so much to help on the ranch. She had ridden horses since she was a child, helped her father tend to the cattle, and even took care of the crops. She had done everything expected of her. And yet, here she was, tangled in ropes, struggling to meet a standard that no longer felt meaningful. Eliza's mind began to race. Was she doomed to live her life according to old rules that didn't make sense to her anymore? Was her father's pride in the McAllister name really worth the weight it placed on her shoulders? The more she pulled, the more the ropes seemed to twist, and the more she realized that the battle wasn't just with the reins. It was with herself. The sun grew hotter and Eliza's frustration turned to exhaustion. She felt her hands tremble as she gripped the ropes, trying to make one last effort to pull them apart. But they were stubborn, just like the past, just like her father's unshakable belief in tradition. In that moment, Eliza heard the sound of boots crunching in the dry grass behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know it was her father. Henry McAllister was never far from his daughter, even when he wasn't standing beside her. Eliza had always felt his watchful presence, like a shadow that followed her wherever she went. It was both a comfort and a burden. "How's it going?" Henry asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Eliza didn't answer at first. She kept her focus on the reins, trying to untangle the ropes, but the words burned in her throat. She wanted to shout, to throw the reins aside and walk away. She wanted to say everything that had been building up inside her for years, but instead she stayed silent. "I'm not sure I can do it, Pa," she said finally, her voice low and filled with frustration. This isn't how it should be. It's not the way I want to prove myself." Henry stood there for a moment, watching her. His weathered face showed no sign of surprise. He had always known how hard this would be for her. He had seen the fire in her eyes, the desire to carve her own path, but he also knew that tradition was something that ran deep in the McAllister family. It wasn't something easily broken. "I know it's hard," he said after a long pause, his voice quieter now. "But it's part of what we do. It's what your grandmother did, and her mother before her." Eliza stood up, wiping her hands on her pants, and turned to face her father. Her eyes were filled with frustration, but beneath the anger was something deeper, a growing sense of rebellion. She had never been one to follow blindly, to accept things just because they had always been done a certain way. "Why do we have to keep doing things the same way?" she asked. Her voice tinged with more than just frustration now. It was a question that had been burning in her mind for years. "Why can't I do things my way? Why can't I prove myself in my own time, on my own terms?" Henry's face softened, but his voice remained steady. "You've already proven yourself, Eliza. I've seen you work this land since you were a little girl. You've done more than enough to earn your place here. But sometimes tradition isn't about proving anything. It's about remembering where you come from." Eliza shook her head, the weight of his words heavy on her heart. She understood what he was saying, but it felt like an excuse. She didn't want to be tied to the past. She didn't want to be defined by what had been done before her. "I just don't know if I can do it, Pa," she said softly, her voice cracking. She looked down at the tangled reins again, her chest tightening. "I don't know if I want to anymore." Henry stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He looked at her, his eyes soft but full of understanding. "You don't have to do it, Eliza. Not if it doesn't feel right to you." Eliza looked up at him, her heart racing. For the first time, her father's words felt like freedom. He wasn't pushing her to follow the tradition. He wasn't forcing her to prove herself in a way that felt wrong. For the first time, Eliza realized she had the power to choose her own path. The sun hung high in the sky now, casting long shadows across the dusty ranch. Eliza sat down on the ground, her legs sore from hours of working with the reins. She wiped the sweat from her brow and stared at the tangled mess in front of her. The ropes seemed to mock her, each knot tighter than the last. It was as though the more she tried to untangle them, the more they twisted together, creating an even bigger knot. Every pull she made only seemed to make the situation worse. She felt her father's gaze on her from a distance, but this time, it didn't bother her as much. She was used to his watchful presence, always observing, always waiting for her to prove herself. But today, his silence felt different. He hadn't spoken since their conversation earlier, and now, as he stood there watching her struggle, Eliza wondered what he was thinking. He had always been the type to push her, to test her strength. But today, his usual sharp encouragements were missing. The more Eliza worked at the reins, the more she felt a mixture of anger and confusion rising in her chest. Her father was right about one thing. She had always worked hard for everything she had, always done what was expected of her. She had never been one to back down from a challenge. But this felt different. This wasn't about proving her strength or skill. It was about something deeper, something she wasn't sure she could change. She glanced at the barn, her eyes drawn to the old, weathered wood that had been standing for as long as she could remember. This ranch had been in the McAllister family for generations. The land, the animals, the traditions, they all seemed so firmly planted in the past. And it wasn't just the Rains. It was everything about the way her family operated. They had always done things a certain way, and it was hard to imagine a life where that wasn't true. Eliza closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, trying to calm the frustration that was rising in her chest. The hot wind tugged at her hair, and she could hear the distant call of birds above the fields. But the sounds felt far away, like they belonged to another world. Her focus returned to the ropes, her hands now aching from hours of futile attempts. It was as if the Rains had become a symbol of everything she was fighting against. The weight of expectation, the chains of family tradition that had been passed down from generation to generation. Her mind began to wander as she sat there, lost in her thoughts. She thought of the time she had spent working alongside her father, the days spent riding through the fields, the long hours in the barn, caring for the horses. She had always admired her father, always respected him. But the older she got, the more she realized how different their views had become. Henry McAllister had been raised in a world that demanded tradition, where following the rules was everything. But Eliza was different. She wanted more. She didn't want to be trapped by old customs. She wanted to make her own decisions, to find her own way in the world. Suddenly, she heard a sound behind her, the familiar crunch of boots on dry earth. She looked over her shoulder, and there he was, standing at the edge of the corral. Her father. He was watching her, his arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. Eliza felt a knot form in her throat. She had hoped, even prayed, that he would let her be. But there he was, standing in the same spot where he had stood before, waiting. It was as if he was silently asking her to continue, to keep going, even though she had made it clear how much she was struggling. She turned away quickly, her face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. It wasn't that she didn't want his help. It was that she didn't want to feel like she was failing in front of him. She had spent her whole life trying to live up to his expectations, trying to show him that she was capable, that she could carry the McAllister name with pride. But at that moment, she wasn't sure she could do it anymore. "Pa," Eliza said, her voice tight. She didn't know what else to say. She had been so focused on the Rains, so caught up in her own frustration, that she hadn't even noticed her father walking up to her. Henry took a step closer, his eyes softening as he looked at her. For a moment he didn't speak, just stood there taking in the sight of his daughter sitting in front of the tangled reins, her hands still gripping the ropes. His heart ached. He had always known Eliza was strong, stronger than most people gave her credit for, but he also knew how deeply this tradition weighed on her. He sighed, his voice low and almost gentle. "You don't have to do it, you know." Eliza looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion. She wasn't sure what to make of his words. "What do you mean I have to?" "It's the tradition." Henry shook his head slowly. "No, it's not the only way, Eliza. I've always followed tradition because I thought it was what was expected of me. But I never stopped to think about whether it was the right thing for you, for your future." Eliza felt her heart race. His words were unexpected, a complete contrast to everything he had ever told her. He had always pushed her to be strong, to prove herself. And now here he was saying something entirely different. "You've always taught me that traditions are important," Eliza said, her voice shaking. "That they define who we are." "I know," Henry replied softly. "But maybe we've been holding on to them for too long. Maybe it's time to let go." Eliza looked at him, her mind racing. Let go? Could they really do that? Could they break away from everything that had defined their family for generations? She looked down at the reins again. They still seemed impossible to untangle. But maybe that wasn't the point anymore. Maybe the real challenge wasn't about untangling the ropes. It was about untangling the past and deciding what part of it they wanted to keep. Her hands loosened from the reins, and she sat back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wasn't sure what to do next, but for the first time she felt like there was a choice. There was no rule, no law, that said she had to finish this task. And maybe that was the freedom she had been searching for all along. Henry watched her for a moment longer, then knelt down beside her, his old bones creaking slightly as he moved. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Eliza," he said quietly. "I've watched you work hard your whole life. I've seen your strength. You've already proven yourself." Eliza looked at him, and in that moment she realized that her father wasn't asking her to follow a tradition. He was asking her to make her own path, to decide what was important for her future, not just for the past. Tears filled her eyes as she reached out to take his hand, feeling the roughness of his skin against hers. It was the first time in years that she felt like she didn't have to be anyone but herself. The days that followed the moment Eliza and Henry shared by the corral were filled with a quiet understanding. The ranch, with its vast fields and quiet barns, continued its usual rhythm, but for Eliza everything felt different. The weight that had once pressed on her shoulders, the constant push to meet expectations, was gone. She no longer felt the pressure to prove herself in ways that didn't resonate with her. For the first time in her life, Eliza realized that she had the freedom to choose her own path. The reins, which had once seemed like an obstacle she could never overcome, were no longer a symbol of her worth. They were just ropes, tangled and messy. She didn't have to untangle them to be someone of value. Henry had stepped back, not out of distance, but out of respect for her independence. He had always been the one to lead, to push her, to remind her of the traditions that had shaped their family. But now he had learned something too. He had learned that sometimes breaking tradition could lead to something beautiful, something better. Eliza's first few days without the weight of the tradition were filled with a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in years. She threw herself into the work on the ranch, but this time, she worked with a new kind of energy. It wasn't about following rules or completing tasks to prove a point. It was about doing what she loved, tending to the land and the animals, creating something with her own hands that was meaningful to her. One morning, as Eliza stood by the barn, watching the horses graze in the field, she felt a quiet joy settle over her. The ranch had always been her home, but now it felt like it truly belonged to her. She was no longer just the daughter of Henry McAllister. She was Eliza McAllister, a rancher in her own right, with her own dreams and ambitions. Henry stood nearby, watching his daughter as she worked. His heart swelled with pride. He had always known that Eliza had something special inside of her, something that went beyond the family traditions and the expectations of others. He had always seen her as capable, strong, and determined, but now he saw her in a new light. She was free to make her own choices and carve out her own place in the world. He had been wrong to hold on to the past so tightly, and for the first time, he could see that the future didn't have to be built on old customs. The future, Eliza's future, would be built on her own terms. One afternoon, as they sat together at the porch, the sun dipping low on the horizon, Eliza turned to her father. "Pa, I've been thinking," she began, her voice thoughtful. "I know we've always been a family that takes pride in the ranch and the work we do, but maybe it's time we think about doing things a little differently." Henry raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "Well," Eliza said, looking out at the fields, "maybe we don't need to follow the same old ways. I want to explore new ideas, new ways of growing things. I want to bring more animals to the ranch. Maybe start breeding horses the way we used to, but with a modern twist. There's a lot of potential here, Pa, if we're open to change." Henry smiled slowly. He could see the fire in Eliza's eyes, the same fire that had always been there. But now it wasn't a fire of rebellion. It was a fire of possibility. "I think you're right," he said after a long pause. "Maybe we've been stuck in our ways too long. It's time for something new. We'll try it your way." Eliza felt a rush of excitement in her chest. This was her chance. Her chance to take everything she had learned and build something of her own, something that was true to her. It wasn't about rejecting the past. It was about honoring it while moving forward. Her father's willingness to embrace change made her heart swell with gratitude. They were no longer bound by the traditions that had once defined them. They were free to make their own rules. The following weeks were filled with planning and hard work. Eliza set her sights on improving the ranch, introducing new farming methods, and even experimenting with different ways of raising livestock. She started working with the land in ways that felt natural to her, using techniques that she had researched and learned about over the years. Henry, though hesitant at first, found himself supporting her every step of the way. He was proud of his daughter, proud of her courage to push forward and take the ranch into a new direction. As they worked side by side, Eliza noticed how much their relationship had changed. They no longer fought against each other, each trying to prove a point. Instead, they worked together, each respecting the other's vision. Henry had given Eliza the freedom to choose her path, and in return, she had shown him that change didn't mean losing who you were, it meant growing. One evening, as they sat on the porch again, watching the stars appear one by one in the sky, Eliza turned to her father. "Pa, I know we've had our differences, but I want you to know that I couldn't have done this without you." Henry looked at her, a soft smile playing on his lips. "You've always had it in you, Eliza. I just needed to see it. I'm proud of you, more than you know." The words were simple, but they meant the world to Eliza. For so long she had struggled to live up to expectations. But now, with her father's support, she felt like she could do anything. She could take the ranch forward, build a life that was her own, and still honor the legacy of the McAllister family. And so, with the reins still lying forgotten in the corner of the barn, Eliza began her new journey. The ranch was no longer a place where she had to prove herself. It was a place where she could grow, experiment, and live her life on her own terms. The future was wide open, and for the first time Eliza felt truly free. The silence that followed Eliza's words felt thick, almost as if the entire ranch was holding its breath. The reins, still tangled in front of them, seemed to stretch out into the distance, a symbol of everything Eliza had been fighting against. Her father, Henry, had always been the rock of their family, steady, unyielding, and unshakable. But today something had shifted, and for the first time Eliza didn't feel like she had to fight to prove herself. Her eyes met his, searching his face for any sign of what he was thinking, but Henry's expression remained calm, his usual sternness replaced with a quiet understanding. There was no judgment in his gaze, no frustration. Instead, it was as if he too had come to a realization. Henry took a deep breath, glancing back down at the reins. The ropes lay in front of them, twisted and knotted in ways that seemed almost impossible to undo. The tradition, the ritual that had been passed down through generations of McAllister women was still there, but now it felt like it no longer held the power it once did. Eliza wasn't the same person her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother had been, and Henry realized in that moment that maybe it was time to let her carve her own path. "You don't have to untangle the reins, Eliza," Henry said, his voice low but firm. "Not if it doesn't feel right. I've always thought that this was something you had to prove, but now I see that it's not about proving anything. Not to me, not to anyone. It's about what you want." Eliza blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. His words were unexpected, but they filled her with a deep sense of relief. She had never imagined her father would say something like this. She had spent her whole life feeling like she had to live up to his expectations, like she had to be the perfect McAllister daughter. But now, for the first time, he was giving her the freedom to decide what her life would look like. She swallowed hard, trying to hold back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "But I've always been told I had to do it, that it's part of who I am, part of the family legacy," she said quietly, her voice shaky. Henry nodded slowly, his eyes softening as he looked at his daughter. "I know, Eliza, I know. But sometimes we get so caught up in tradition that we forget what really matters. You've always worked hard. You've always done your part. That's what matters to me, not some old ritual." Eliza felt the weight on her chest begin to lift, and for the first time in days she felt like she could breathe again. She looked down at the reins, the symbol of everything that had been expected of her. And for a moment they didn't seem so important. They were just ropes, just knots, just pieces of string tangled together. "I don't know what to do now," Eliza said softly, more to herself than to her father. "I've spent my whole life doing what I was told. I've always followed the rules, worked the land the way it's always been done. I don't know how to let go of that." Henry sat down beside her, his old bones creaking as he lowered himself to the ground. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch steady and reassuring. "It's not easy, Eliza. I've spent my whole life doing what I thought was right, never questioning it. But sometimes breaking free from tradition isn't about rejecting the past. It's about finding your own way forward, and you don't have to do it all at once. Take it one step at a time." Eliza looked at her father, his face worn and tired but filled with wisdom. For the first time, she realized that he wasn't just a father who wanted to keep her in line. He was a man who had been shaped by the same traditions, the same expectations, and now, after all these years, he was finally ready to let her go, to let her make her own choices. Maybe I don't have to untangle these reins," Eliza said, her voice gaining strength. "Maybe I don't have to prove anything to anyone. Maybe it's enough that I'm doing the best I can in my own way." Henry smiled, the lines on his face softening. "Exactly. You've always been enough, Eliza. I've seen that every day. You've proven yourself time and time again in ways that are far more important than some old tradition." Eliza's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She had been carrying this weight for so long, this unspoken expectation that she had to be perfect, that she had to follow the rules. But now, for the first time in her life, she felt like she could breathe. She didn't have to be anyone else. She could be herself. "Thank you, Pa," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for letting me be me." Henry's smile grew wider and he pulled her into a hug. It wasn't a long hug, but it was enough. A moment of understanding, of connection that went beyond words. "You've always been you, Eliza. I just didn't see it until now." For a long time they sat there together, the reins forgotten between them. The ranch, the fields and the horses, the things that had always been so important to Henry seemed less urgent now. Eliza realized that the real work of the ranch, the heart of it, wasn't in the traditions or the rituals. It was in the people, the ones who worked the land, the ones who cared for it, the ones who had the courage to change when the time came. Eliza stood up slowly, her hands on her hips, looking out over the land. For the first time, she didn't feel bound by the past. She didn't feel trapped by the expectations of her father or the weight of tradition. Instead, she felt free to make her own decisions, to decide what kind of rancher and what kind of person she wanted to be. "I think I'm ready to make my own way," Eliza said, her voice steady and full of determination. "I'm going to keep working the land, keep caring for the animals, but I'm going to do it on my own terms. I don't need the reins to prove that." Henry nodded, his heart swelling with pride. He knew his daughter was ready. She had always been ready. "I'm proud of you, Eliza," he said simply, and for the first time in a long time, he meant it in a way that went beyond the past, beyond tradition. It was a new beginning, for both of them. In this fourth part, Eliza and Henry both experience a moment of growth and understanding. Henry's decision to let go of tradition marks a significant turning point in their relationship. The moment when Eliza realizes she doesn't have to follow the past to be worthy of her father's love is a powerful one, highlighting the importance of self-acceptance and change. The chapter sets the stage for their future, where Eliza will forge her own path while still holding on to the values that truly matter.